The tray hit the floor before she even knew it was falling. 6 glasses of wine, gone in 1 second. Red wine exploding across white marble, splashing up onto silk dresses, soaking straight through Tina's uniform, like a wound that wouldn't stop spreading. The whole restaurant went silent. Then Hana Kim laughed. "Oh my God." She pressed a hand to her chest, eyes wide with fake shock, milking every second of it. "Did everyone just see that? She threw wine all over us." "I didn't." Tina's voice came out steady, even with her hands shaking. "That was an accident. I'm so sorry. Let me clean." "Accident?" Hana's voice cracked across the room like a whip. Heads turned. Phones rose. "You just ruined my dress. Do you know what this dress costs?" Nobody in that restaurant had seen Hana's heel shoot out from under the table. Nobody had seen her trip Tina on purpose. They only saw a black waitress standing in a puddle of wine and a rich woman furious enough to make her pay for it. "On your knees," Hana said. The room held its breath. "Clean it. Properly. I want to see some respect from staff who clearly forgot their place." Glasses clinked somewhere in the silence. A phone camera blinked red. Someone whispered, "Is she serious right now?" Nobody moved. Nobody ever does. Tina knelt, not because she was weak, because she'd survived worse than this, and she knew exactly when fighting back would cost her everything. What Hana didn't know, what she could never have guessed, was that 2 floors above her, behind glass that looked like a mirror from the dining room, and nothing like a mirror from the other side, a man hadn't taken his eyes off the screen since the tray hit the floor. A man nobody had photographed in 6 years. A man the underground simply called Chairman K. He set down his whiskey, leaned forward, and said 2 words to the man standing beside him. "Watch her." Because the woman on her knees down there wasn't falling apart. She was calculating. And by morning, Hana Kim was going to learn exactly what it costs to humiliate the one person in that restaurant nobody should have touched. If you are new here, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming in this one. Smash that like button, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is over there. Before we go into today's story, if you love powerful mafia boss romances filled with passion, secrets, shocking twists, and unforgettable happy endings, you'll love the Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. It includes 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, plus 5 exclusive bonus stories you won't find on YouTube. You can grab your copy through the link in the description. Now let's get into it. Because to understand exactly how Tina Johnson ended up on her knees on a restaurant floor in Gangnam, soaked in wine and being watched by a man the underground called Chairman K, we have to go back. Not weeks, not months, years. 3 years before that night, Tina Johnson had been a different woman entirely. She'd grown up in Lagos, raised by a mother who sold fabric in the market and a father who worked nights as a security guard at a shipping company. The kind of company where men in expensive suits moved cargo that didn't always match what was written on the paperwork. Tina had been brilliant in school, the kind of brilliant that made teachers pull her mother aside to whisper about scholarships and universities abroad. She'd studied logistics and international trade at university in Lagos, graduated near the top of her class, and landed a junior compliance role at a freight company that handled imports across West Africa and parts of Asia. It should have been the beginning of everything she'd worked for. Instead, it became the reason she had to disappear. 18 months into the job, Tina had noticed something in the shipping manifests that didn't add up. Containers logged as industrial machinery that weighed far too little for machinery. Routes that zigzagged through ports with almost no customs oversight. Money moving through shell companies that existed only on paper. She hadn't gone looking for trouble. She'd simply been good at her job. The kind of good that noticed inconsistencies other people were paid to ignore. She made the mistake of mentioning it to her supervisor. 3 weeks later, the company's internal audit conveniently discovered that funds were missing from an account Tina had access to. An account she had never personally touched. An account that existed specifically to be blamed on someone replaceable. The evidence was fabricated with the kind of precision that only comes from people who have done this before. People who understood exactly how to make an innocent woman look guilty enough that nobody would ask too many questions. Within a month, there was a warrant for her arrest back home. Within 2 months, she understood that the freight company wasn't moving machinery at all. It was moving something far more valuable and far more illegal, something connected to people who did not forgive loose ends. And Tina Johnson had become a loose end the moment she opened her mouth. A family friend with connections to an international relocation program, the kind of underground network that existed specifically to disappear witnesses before they became bodies, had helped her vanish. New documents, new name on paper, though she kept Tina because changing everything about herself felt like losing the last piece of who she actually was. A flight to Seoul, a city where almost nobody who knew her old life would think to look, and a job waiting for her at a restaurant whose ownership structure was so deliberately confusing that even the people who worked there didn't fully understand who they answered to. She'd told herself it would be temporary. A year, maybe 2, until the legal situation back home resolved itself, until the people who wanted her silenced lost interest or lost power, whichever came first. That had been 2 years ago. Now let's talk about Hana Kim. Because to understand why she did what she did that night, you have to understand the world she came from, a world where cruelty was simply currency, and Hana had inherited more of it than most. Hana was 28 years old, the only daughter of a man who owned 3 luxury department store chains across Seoul and Busan, the kind of wealth that didn't just buy comfort, but bought immunity. She had grown up being told that respect was something you took, not something you earned, and the people closest to her, the household staff who raised her more than her own parents did, had learned the hard way that crossing Hana Kim, even slightly, could cost them everything. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, polished and curated and entirely aware of its own value. She had 3 friends who orbited her like moons, Suyeon and Yuri among them, women who laughed when she laughed and grew quiet when she grew cold. Because being in Hana's circle came with rules. And the first rule was that Hana was never, under any circumstances, wrong. What people didn't see, what even her friends didn't fully understand, was the engine underneath all of it. Hana had spent her entire life being compared to her older brother, the golden heir who would inherit the company, while she was groomed for marriage into another wealthy family, treated like a transaction waiting to be finalized, rather than a person with her own ambitions. Every act of cruelty she dished out to people beneath her was, in some twisted way, an attempt to feel power in a life where she had very little of her own. It didn't excuse anything she was about to do, it just explained it. And then there was the man upstairs, Chairman K. The public knew almost nothing about him, and that was exactly how he liked it. No interviews, no photographs taken in the last 6 years, no social media footprint, nothing that could connect a face to the empire that quietly touched shipping ports, construction conglomerates, private security firms, and yes, a small but very particular chain of restaurants across Seoul that served as meeting points for people who needed somewhere discreet to talk business that wasn't always legal. His real name was Kang Do-yoon, though almost nobody used it anymore. He was 41 years old, built like a man who had once trained for things far more violent than boardroom negotiations. And he ran his organization the way his father had taught him, with patience instead of noise, with information instead of threats. Because in his world, the man who reacted emotionally was always the first one to lose. His father had built the foundation of the empire from nothing. Smuggling, then shipping, then legitimate fronts layered over illegitimate cores, and had died when Do-yoon was 26, leaving him an inheritance that came with enemies attached like teeth marks. Do-yoon had spent 15 years since then, making sure nobody mistook his quiet for weakness. The restaurant where Tina worked was one of 17 properties he controlled through a chain of holding companies so deliberately tangled that even his own lawyers needed a flowchart to explain it. He visited maybe once a month, always through a private entrance, always to the same booth on the second floor, behind glass that looked like a mirror from the dining room but was in fact completely transparent from his side. He liked watching the restaurant function. He liked understanding who his staff actually were beneath the uniforms. Because in his experience, the people serving the wine were always more interesting than the people drinking it. He had noticed Tina months earlier. Not romantically. Not yet. But the way a chess player notices a piece moving with unusual precision on a board nobody else is paying attention to. She moved efficiently, she never wasted motion. She remembered every regular's preferences without writing anything down. And once, months before, when a drunk businessman had grabbed her wrist a little too hard while complaining about his order, Duyun had watched her redirect the situation so smoothly, so calmly, that the businessman walked away thinking he'd simply changed his own mind. That kind of control under pressure wasn't trained into ordinary waitresses. He'd made a note of it and moved on. Because a man in his position couldn't afford to be curious about every interesting person who crossed his path. But that night, the night Hana Kim decided to turn Tina's humiliation into a public performance, that curiosity came roaring back with a vengeance. And this time, Do-yoon wasn't going to look away. The night had started ordinarily enough. The restaurant, called Cheongdam Noir, occupied the top 2 floors of a glass building in one of Seoul's most expensive districts, the kind of place where reservations were booked months in advance and the wine list alone cost more than most people's monthly salary. Tina had clocked in at 4 in the afternoon, tied her apron with the same practiced motion she used every day, and reviewed her section assignments with Ngozi, her closest friend at the restaurant, and the only person there who knew even a fraction of her real story. Ngozi was loud where Tina was quiet, dramatic where Tina was composed, and the kind of friend who made even the worst shifts bearable through sheer comic timing. She was Nigerian too, though from Port Harcourt rather than Lagos, and the two of them had bonded almost instantly over shared food cravings the restaurant's French-Korean fusion menu could never satisfy. You know, table 14 has been rebooked 4 times this month, Ngozi said that evening, peeking at the reservation list over Tina's shoulder. Same woman, Hana Kim. You know who that is? Should I? Girl, her father owns half the department stores in this city. Last time she was here she made poor Jun-woo cry in the kitchen because his English wasn't good enough for her liking. The man has been working here 3 years and speaks better English than half the customers. Tina had laughed despite herself, a small, tired laugh, the kind she rationed carefully because laughing too freely sometimes made her forget to keep her guard up. Then I'll stay far away from table 14. You're working table 14 tonight. Ngozi. I don't make the schedule, I just suffer through it with you. Want me to switch with you? Tina had hesitated for half a second, the kind of hesitation that, looking back, would feel almost prophetic. No, it's fine. How bad can one dinner be? Famous last words. Besties. Famous. Last. Words. By 6:30, the restaurant was at full capacity, the kind of packed evening service where every server moved like part of a single coordinated machine, weaving between tables with trays balanced and orders memorized. The open kitchen sending up clouds of garlic and butter that made the whole room smell like something out of a dream. Tina had handled 6 tables flawlessly by the time Hana Kim arrived fashionably 40 minutes late, with 3 friends trailing behind her like an entourage that had been assembled specifically for this performance. From the moment Hana sat down, something in the air at table 14 shifted. Water, Hannah said without looking up from her phone, snapping her fingers in Tina's direction like she was calling a dog. Sparkling, and make sure it's cold this time, not room temperature like last week. Of course, Tina said, keeping her voice level and pleasant, the way she'd trained herself to do, regardless of what was happening underneath. I'll have that right out for you. What's your name again? Hana asked, finally glancing up, her eyes doing a slow, deliberate scan from Tina's face down to her uniform and back up again. The kind of look that made you feel measured and found lacking before a single word was exchanged. Tina! Tina! Hana repeated it slowly, exaggerating each syllable, twisting her mouth around it, like the name itself was something distasteful. That's an interesting name. Where's that from again? Africa somewhere? Nigeria, Tina said evenly. Of course. Hana turned back to her friends without waiting for a reaction, already moving on to something else, already treating the exchange as complete, as though Tina's entire identity had just been filed away into a folder marked unimportant. It got worse from there, the way these things always do. By the time the appetizers arrived, Hana had complained that the bread was too cold, then too warm when it was reheated. Then, fine, I guess, if that's the best you can do. She'd asked Tina to repeat the wine list twice, not because she didn't understand it, Tina realized, but because she enjoyed watching Tina recite it patiently both times. She'd snapped photos of her friends at the table and loudly narrated them for an Instagram story, making sure to mention, just loud enough for Tina to hear while passing. The service here used to be so much better before they started hiring just anyone. Suyan and Yuri laughed along nervously, the kind of laughter that comes from people who know exactly what's happening and have decided it's easier to participate than object. By the time the main courses arrived, Hana had started mispronouncing Tina's name on purpose, loudly, theatrically, turning it into a punchline for her table. Tina! Can you bring more napkins? Tina, this steak is overcooked. Each variation drew another round of laughter from her friends, and each time, Tina simply nodded and corrected nothing, because correcting Hana Kim would only have given her more ammunition. Across the dining room, an older couple at table 9 had begun glancing over uncomfortably, the way people do when they witness cruelty but lack the spine to interrupt it. A businessman near the window had actually turned in his chair to watch, his expression unreadable, the kind of man who noticed everything and said nothing, which, had anyone known to look closer, might have reminded them of someone else entirely watching from 2 floors above. "You good?" Ngozi whispered, passing close behind Tina near the kitchen pass. "I'm fine," Tina said, which was a lie, but a practiced one, the kind she'd told herself so many times in the last 2 years that it almost sounded true. "That woman is something else." "That woman is a customer," Tina said. "And customers, even terrible ones, are rent money." Ngozi snorted. "Rent money or not, the day she pushes too far, I want front row seats." If she'd known how soon that day was coming, she might not have joked about it. The trouble truly began when Hana ordered a bottle of 2014 Bordeaux that cost more than Tina made in 2 weeks, then complained that the temperature wasn't quite right, sending it back not once but twice, watching with thinly veiled delight each time Tina had to walk the long route back to the cellar and return with a new bottle. Her tray balanced perfectly despite the building exhaustion in her arms and the building tension in her chest. On the 3rd trip, as Tina approached the table with a tray of 6 freshly poured glasses for a toast, Hana had decided the table needed to celebrate absolutely nothing in particular. Hana shifted in her seat at exactly the wrong moment, her heel sliding out from beneath the white tablecloth and catching Tina's ankle with deliberate, practiced precision. Time seemed to slow down the way it does in the half-second before disaster. The tray tilting, the glasses sliding, Tina's body twisting instinctively to try to save what couldn't be saved. And then the crash. The unmistakable, room-silencing sound of crystal meeting marble, wine spraying across white linen and pale dresses and polished shoes. And for 3 full seconds, the entire restaurant simply stopped. Then Hana's laugh cut through the silence like a blade. "Oh my God," she said, pressing one manicured hand to her chest, as though she herself had been the victim of an assault. "Did you see that? She just threw an entire tray at us." "I didn't," Tina started, her voice steady even as her pulse hammered against her throat. "I'm so sorry. That was an accident. Let me—" "An accident?" Hana's voice rose, pitched perfectly for an audience, now fully turned toward table 14, phones already rising into the air, like flowers blooming toward the sun. "You just ruined my dress. Do you know how much this dress cost? Do you have any idea?" The manager, a nervous man named Mr. O, who had spent the better part of 2 decades perfecting the art of appeasing wealthy clientele at the expense of everyone beneath them, materialized at the table within seconds, his apologies already spilling out before he'd even fully assessed what had happened. "Miss Kim, I am so deeply sorry. Please, let us comp your entire table tonight. Let us." "I don't want a comped dinner," Hannah snapped, her eyes never leaving Tina. "I want to know why this restaurant continues to employ staff who can't do the most basic part of their job." "It wasn't her fault," came a quiet voice from table 9. The older woman who'd been watching uncomfortably for the last 20 minutes. But Hana's friend Yuri shot her a look so cold, the woman simply shrank back into her seat and said nothing more. Mr. O turned to Tina, his face a mixture of fear and apology, aimed entirely in the wrong direction. "Tina, please, apologize properly to Miss Kim." And Tina, soaked in wine, surrounded by phones and whispers and the particular cruelty of a room full of people who would rather watch than help, did exactly that. "I'm very sorry," she said, her voice clear and controlled, despite the trembling in her hands. "I'll clean this immediately." It should have ended there. It didn't. Because Hana Kim, riding the high of an audience and the particular thrill of watching someone she'd decided was beneath her bend completely, leaned back in her chair with a smile that made the temperature of the room seem to drop several degrees, and said the words that would end up changing far more lives than just her own that night. "On your knees," she said. "I want to see you clean this up properly. On your knees. Like staff who forget their place should." For a moment nobody moved. Even Mr. O hesitated, some flickering instinct of decency briefly surfacing before being smothered by years of training in obedience to wealth. The dining room held its breath, phones angled, recording lights blinking red across the room like a constellation of judgment. And Tina Johnson, who had survived a fabricated theft accusation, a forced disappearance from her own country, and 2 years of building a life from nothing under a constant low hum of fear, looked at the woman in front of her and made a calculation that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with survival. She knelt, 2 floors above, behind glass that looked like a mirror to everyone below but was perfectly clear from where he sat. Kang Do-yoon set down his whiskey glass without taking a single sip. He had been half watching the dining room the way he always did when he visited, more out of habit than active interest, scrolling through a tablet of shipping manifests for one of his legitimate fronts, when the commotion at table 14 had pulled his attention fully upward. He'd watched the tray fall. He'd watched the laughter. He'd watched the manager fold like wet paper in the face of money. And now he watched a woman kneel on his restaurant's floor, soaked in wine, surrounded by people recording her humiliation for entertainment, and something in his chest, something he hadn't felt activate in longer than he could remember, sharpened into focus. Beside him, the man who had been standing silently against the wall for the last 20 minutes, his right hand in the organization and the only person alive who could speak to Do-yoon the way ordinary men spoke to each other, shifted his weight slightly. "You want me to handle the socialite?" Suho asked, his tone deliberately light, the kind of casual that always preceded something sharper. "I can make her dinner reservation disappear from every restaurant in this city by morning. Permanently. Like, banned from Seoul fine dining forever, kind of disappear." "Not yet," Do-yoon said, his eyes still locked on the screen below. "You're staring at the waitress, not the rich one humiliating her. That's a little backwards, boss, even for you." "Look at her hands," Do-yoon said quietly. Suho leaned forward, squinting at the feed. "Her hands are shaking. That's pretty normal for someone being forced to kneel in public, no? Look at her face." Suho looked. Tina's hands trembled. Yes, but her expression remained almost unnervingly composed, her jaw set, her eyes scanning the spreading wine on the floor with something that looked less like humiliation and more like quiet, methodical assessment. "She's not panicking," Do-yoon said. "She's calculating. Watch. She's about to do something." And sure enough, even as Hana continued her tirade from above, even as the cameras kept rolling, Tina's eyes flicked briefly toward a spreading puddle of wine creeping toward another guest's pale silk shoes at the next table. A complete stranger who had nothing to do with any of this, and without a word, without drawing any attention to herself, she shifted her cleaning cloth slightly to redirect the spill before it could ruin yet another innocent person's evening. Do-yoon had seen 1,000 people break under public pressure in his life. He had broken several of them himself, in rooms far darker than this restaurant, for reasons far less trivial than a spilled bottle of wine. He knew, with the kind of certainty that came from 15 years of reading people for a living, that what he was watching was not normal. That was not the behavior of a frightened waitress trying to survive an unfair shift. That was the behavior of someone trained to function under pressure, trained to think clearly while everything around her was collapsing. The exact same quality he looked for in his own people. The exact same quality that had kept him alive through more situations than he cared to count. "Pull her file," he said. "Her HR file? Boss? It's a waitress." Not a pull her file. Do-yeon's voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen, but something in it made Suho straighten immediately and reach for his phone, without another word of protest. On it, Suho said. Then, because he genuinely could not help himself, he added, for what it's worth, I think this is the most interested I've seen you in a woman in about 4 years. Should I be planning a wedding or an extraction? Suho. Just checking the temperature of the room, boss. Just checking. Do-yoon didn't answer, his attention already back on the screen, on the woman now rising slowly from her knees, wine dripping from the hem of her uniform, her expression unreadable to everyone in that restaurant except, perhaps, the one man watching from above, who had spent his entire life learning to read exactly what people tried hardest to hide. Because as Tina stood, brushing wine from her sleeves, with as much dignity as a person could possibly summon in that moment, something passed across her face that Do-yoon recognized instantly. Having worn the exact same expression himself, more times than he could count, across 15 years of building and protecting an empire that could collapse at any moment if he ever let his guard down. It wasn't shame, it was the quiet, practiced calm of someone who had survived worse than this, who had been forced to swallow far greater indignities for far higher stakes, and who understood, on some bone-deep level, that the moment to react was never the moment of crisis itself. It was always the moment after, when nobody expected you to still be standing. And Hana Kim, flushed with the high of her own cruelty, turning to her friends with a satisfied smile as she gestured for her assistant to pull out her phone, had absolutely no idea that the video she was about to upload to the internet, the video meant to humiliate a stranger for entertainment, was about to expose something so dangerous that it would pull the attention of people far more frightening than a Korean mafia boss watching from a private booth. People who had been searching for Tina Johnson for 2 years. People who had never stopped looking. Upload it, Hana said to her assistant, a quiet, nervous young woman named Yoonbi, who had been hovering at the edge of the table all evening, holding Hana's bag and phone like a human accessory. Caption it something like, "Lesson in respect," or "When staff forget who's actually paying their salary." Something catchy. Yoonbi hesitated for half a second, glancing at Tina's bowed head, the wine still dripping from her chin, and something flickered across her face that might have been guilt, if guilt was something Hana's circle still allowed themselves to feel. "Upload it," Hana repeated, sharper this time, and Yoonbi's thumb moved across the screen. Neither of them noticed, as the phone's camera had panned briefly downward during the worst of Tina's humiliation, what exactly had been captured in that footage. A small detail at the edge of Tina's wrist, just below her server's wristwatch. A faint mark in dark ink that most people would dismiss as a simple tattoo. A small sparrow with its wings spread mid-flight. Nothing more than decoration to the untrained eye, but to a very specific, very dangerous network of people scattered across several countries. People who specialized in protecting witnesses too valuable and too threatened to disappear through ordinary means. That mark meant something else entirely. It meant they had finally found her. And within minutes of that video reaching the internet, several phones belonging to people Tina Johnson had spent 2 years desperately hoping never to see again began buzzing with notifications, each one carrying the same image, the same mark, the same unmistakable confirmation. She was alive, she was in Seoul, and she had just been humiliated on camera for the entire world to see exactly where to find her. The restaurant didn't return to normal after that. Not really. Conversations resumed in hushed, uncertain murmurs, the kind of low chatter that fills a room after everyone has witnessed something they know they should have stopped and didn't. Forks scraped against plates again. A waiter near the bar dropped a glass, the small crash making half the room flinch. The memory of what had just happened, still too fresh, too raw, hanging over Cheongdam Noir like smoke that refused to clear. Hana Kim, for her part, looked thoroughly pleased with herself. She finished her wine, ordered dessert, and laughed at something Yuri said, as though the last 10 minutes hadn't happened at all. As though she hadn't just forced a stranger to kneel on a marble floor in front of 40 witnesses and a dozen phone cameras. To her, it was already over. Filed away. Forgotten. Just another evening where the world had reminded her of exactly how much power she carried and exactly how little it cost her to use it. Tina, meanwhile, had been quietly pulled aside by Mr. O, who, in a rare display of something resembling decency, told her to go clean up and finish out the night in the back, away from table 14, away from the cameras that were still occasionally turning in her direction even now. "I'm sorry," he muttered as she passed him, not quite meeting her eyes. "I know that wasn't fair to you." "Then why didn't you say so when it mattered?" Tina asked. Not unkindly, just tired, the kind of exhausted that settles into your bones. After years of being the person who has to swallow things other people get to throw. Mr. O had no answer for that. There rarely was one. She made it to the staff restroom before the tears came. And even then, she gave herself exactly 90 seconds, no more. Because 90 seconds was what she could afford before someone might notice she was gone too long and start asking questions she didn't have safe answers for. She gripped the edge of the sink, looked at her reflection, wine still staining the collar of her white shirt, like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, and breathed. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. It was a technique she'd learned from a counselor at the relocation program, back when she'd first arrived in Seoul. Back when the nightmares were so bad, she'd wake up convinced someone was already in her apartment waiting for her. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. It didn't fix anything, but it gave her hands something to focus on besides shaking. The door opened. Ngozi slipped in, closing it softly behind her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. Ngozi just crossed the small room and wrapped her arms around Tina from behind, resting her chin on her shoulder, the way she always did when words weren't going to be enough. "I should have switched tables with you," Ngozi said quietly. "It wasn't your fault. I know. Doesn't mean I don't feel sick about it." Ngozi pulled back slightly, studying Tina's face in the mirror. "You okay? And I don't mean the customer service kind of okay. I mean actually okay." Tina was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she admitted finally, which, for a woman who had spent 2 years perfecting the art of always knowing exactly what to say, was its own kind of confession. "I knelt on a restaurant floor tonight, in front of 40 strangers and a dozen cameras. Ngozi, do you understand what that does to a person? After everything I already survived just to get here, I knelt because some rich girl wanted a show." "You survived it," Ngozi said firmly. "That's not weakness, that's strategy. You've told me yourself, the people who survive the longest aren't the ones who fight every battle. They're the ones who know which ones aren't worth dying over. I sound very wise when you repeat my own advice back to me. I know, right? I should charge for therapy." Ngozi cracked a small smile, and despite everything, Tina felt the corner of her own mouth twitch upward. Just slightly, just enough. "Also, for the record, if that woman comes back next week, I am personally requesting her table, and I will be bringing her the slowest, coldest service this restaurant has ever produced. Accidentally, of course. You'll get fired. Worth it. I'll put it on my resume. Professional petty revenge specialist, 3 years experience." Tina laughed then. A real laugh. Small and surprised. The first one in what felt like hours. And for a moment, just a moment, the weight in her chest loosened enough to let her breathe properly again. 2 floors above, in the private booth behind the glass that looked like a mirror, Suho returned with a tablet in hand and an expression that suggested he'd found something far more interesting than he'd expected. "Okay," he said, sliding into the seat across from Doyun. "So, funny story. I don't like when you start sentences that way. You're going to like this one even less then, because her HR file is basically a ghost." Suho turned the tablet around, showing a sparse digital record, an employment application with minimal references, a visa sponsorship through a small relocation consultancy nobody had heard of, and almost nothing else. Normally when we hire someone, even for a server position, we run background checks, because you know how paranoid you are about who handles the booths near this section. Her check came back clean, but clean in a way that feels engineered, like somebody built her a life specifically so it would pass a background check and nothing more. Do-yoon's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. Engineered how? Education records that check out, but stop abruptly 2.5 years ago. No employment history in Nigeria for the 18 months before she arrived in Korea, which is unusual for someone who supposedly graduated near the top of her university program. And get this. Suho leaned forward, lowering his voice even though they were alone. The visa sponsorship company that brought her here doesn't actually exist as a functioning business. It exists as a shell. A very well-built shell, the kind built by people who know exactly what they're doing. Relocation network, Do-yoon said quietly, more to himself than to Suho. That's my guess too. Witness protection, underground style. The kind that exists because some people can't trust the official system to keep them alive. Suho set the tablet down. Boss, if I'm right about this, that woman downstairs isn't just an unlucky waitress who got humiliated by a rich brat tonight. She's hiding from something. Or someone. Do-yoon was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting back to the dining room below, now mostly cleared of the chaos. The staff moving with practiced efficiency to erase every trace of what had happened. The way staff always did in places like this, sweeping humiliation under expensive rugs as easily as they swept up broken glass. Find out what relocation network sponsored her visa, he said finally, quietly. I don't want anyone outside this room knowing we're asking. On it. Suho hesitated at the door, glancing back. Boss, can I say something without you getting that face you make when I overstep? You're going to say it regardless of my face. Fair. I just think it's worth noting that in 15 years of working for you, I have never once seen you personally order a deep background investigation on a waitress. Usually it's rival shipping executives, corrupt officials, the occasional politician who thinks he can skim off the top without consequences. This is new territory for us. Suho's tone was light, but his eyes were watching carefully. You sure this is just business curiosity? It's business curiosity, Do-yoon said, in a tone that closed the conversation entirely. Suho held up both hands in mock surrender and slipped out, leaving Do-yoon alone with the glow of the screen and the quiet hum of a restaurant slowly returning to its rhythm below, and the unmistakable, uncomfortable awareness that he had just lied to the one person in his organization he never lied to. Because it wasn't only business curiosity. It hadn't been from the moment he watched her redirect that spilled wine away from a stranger's shoes while kneeling in her own humiliation. It was something closer to recognition. The particular electric feeling of watching someone carry a weight you understood intimately because you had carried something similar yourself, once, a long time ago, before patience and silence had become armor instead of just personality traits. He didn't know yet how dangerous that recognition was about to become. Meanwhile, 6,000 kilometers away, in a high-rise office in Lagos belonging to a logistics conglomerate that handled far more than industrial machinery on paper, a phone buzzed against a polished wooden desk. The man who picked it up went by several names depending on which side of the business he was conducting at any given moment. But the people who feared him most simply called him Chief. He was 61 years old, immaculately dressed even at this late hour, and had spent the better part of 2 years and an embarrassing amount of money trying to locate a former compliance officer who had nearly unraveled an operation worth more than most countries' annual budgets. He opened the message his contact had forwarded, a clip from a Korean restaurant, viral within the hour, already racking up shares across platforms for the spectacle of a wealthy young woman humiliating a server in public. He almost dismissed it entirely. Almost. Then he saw the wrist. He paused the video, zoomed in, his jaw tightening as recognition settled in like ice water down his spine. Get me a daise, he said into the phone without preamble, his voice flat and cold in the way that made the people who worked for him understand, instantly, that the temperature in the room had just changed. Now. Within minutes, a woman entered his office, sharp-eyed and silent, the kind of person whose job title officially didn't exist on any company document, but whose presence alone had ended careers and occasionally lives. He turned the screen toward her without a word. Adaeze watched the clip twice. When she looked up, her expression was unreadable. But something in her posture had shifted, the alertness of a predator catching a scent it had nearly given up on. That's her, she said. After 2 years, Seoul. That tattoo is unmistakable, the chief said. Sparrow Network. They marked her as protected before she disappeared, which means somebody is still watching her, which means we have a window, and that window is closing fast. What do you want done? The chief was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of his face. The expression of a man calculating risk against reward, the way he'd done his entire career, the way that had built an empire on the backs of people who never got to make the same calculations about their own lives. She's the only living witness who saw the full manifest discrepancies before the deal closed, he said finally. 2 years, and the case is still open in 3 jurisdictions because of her testimony potential. If she resurfaces officially, if anyone with real authority gets to her before we do, everything we've built since then unravels. The shipments, the partnerships, all of it. So we bring her back. We make sure she never has the chance to talk to anyone who matters again, the chief corrected, his voice cold and final. Quietly, if possible, permanently, regardless. Adaize nodded once, already turning toward the door, already calculating logistics with the same efficiency that had made her invaluable to a man who didn't tolerate inefficiency in any form. Adaize, the chief called after her, and she paused. Whoever owns that restaurant in Seoul, find out. If she's working somewhere that visible, someone is paying attention to her. I want to know who, before we move. I don't want any surprises. It was, perhaps, the single most important instruction he gave that night, and it would prove to be far too late. Before we continue, a quick note for everyone who loves these Mafia Boss romance stories. I've bundled 20 of our most loved Afro-Korean romance stories into the ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. You'll get all 15 complete stories, 20 audiobook versions, plus 5 exclusive bonus stories you won't find on YouTube. If you'd love to enjoy these stories anytime without ads or interruptions, you'll find the link in the description below. By the time Tina finished her shift that night, the video had already crossed 200,000 views. She didn't know that yet. She'd deliberately left her phone in her locker during service, a habit she'd kept since her first month at the restaurant. A small boundary she maintained to keep her 2 lives, the one she lived and the one she'd had to bury, from bleeding into each other more than necessary. She walked home through the cold Seoul night with Ngozi, the 2 of them sharing a single umbrella against a light drizzle, talking about nothing in particular, the kind of ordinary conversation that felt like a small, stolen mercy after everything else. You should report it, Ngozi said as they neared the bus stop. What she did. There has to be some kind of customer conduct policy. And say what? That a paying customer's heel happened to catch my ankle? There's no policy that protects against rich people who know exactly how to make everything look like an accident. There should be a lot of things, Tina said quietly, and something in her tone made Ngozi glance over, sensing, the way close friends sometimes do, that there was a deeper current running beneath the surface of an ordinary complaint. But Tina didn't elaborate, and Ngozi, respecting the boundaries she'd learned to recognize over 2 years of friendship, didn't push. They parted ways at the bus stop, Ngozi heading toward her shared apartment in Hongdae, Tina continuing on foot toward the small one-room studio she rented in a quieter neighborhood. The kind of place chosen specifically because it had 2 exits, because the landlord didn't ask many questions, because it was close enough to the restaurant to walk, but far enough from anywhere flashy that nobody would think to look for her there. She didn't notice the black sedan parked across the street from her building, idling with its headlights off, until she was almost at her front door. She also didn't notice, because there was no way she could have, that inside that sedan sat a man who had landed in Seoul barely 6 hours earlier, a contact working for Adaize, sent ahead while the larger team mobilized, tasked with nothing more than confirmation. Just eyes, just patience, just the kind of waiting that precedes something far worse. She let herself into her building, climbed the narrow stairwell to her floor, and was reaching for her keys when her phone, finally retrieved from her bag, buzzed violently, with a wave of notifications she hadn't checked all evening. She opened the first one out of habit before she could stop herself. A video thumbnail, her own face, her own kneeling form, wine-soaked, surrounded by phones, the caption beneath it written in mocking Korean script, "Lesson in respect, 240,000 views and climbing." Her stomach dropped. She scrolled through the comments without meaning to, the way you can't help touching a bruise to see how badly it still hurts, and found exactly what she expected. Strangers debating her humiliation as entertainment, some defending her, most simply consuming the spectacle the way people consume everything online, as content, as nothing, as noise. And then, near the bottom of the comment section, written in a language she hadn't expected to see, written by an account with no profile picture, and a username made entirely of numbers, a single line that made her blood run cold. "We found you." Her hands began to shake. Not from cold this time. Hey besties, if you felt that chill just now, you are not alone. Because that comment is about to set off a chain of events that nobody in this story is prepared for. Make sure you're subscribed and your notifications are on. Because what happens next happens fast. And I promise you, you do not want to be the one finding out from someone else's comment section. Let's keep going. She stood frozen in the dim hallway outside her apartment door, phone clutched so tightly in her hand that her knuckles had gone pale, the message burning into her vision like an afterimage that refused to fade. "We found you." 2 words, no context, no name attached. And yet she knew, with the particular certainty that only comes from 2 years of living in low-grade fear, exactly what those 2 words meant, and exactly who had sent them. Her first instinct was to run. It always had been. The muscle memory of the last 2 years wired so deeply into her body that her legs had already half-turned toward the stairwell before her mind caught up enough to ask, run where? She had no second identity waiting in another city, no emergency fund large enough to disappear into another country on short notice, no relocation contact left because the network that had moved her here had gone quiet 18 months ago. The funding dried up, the last handler she'd spoken to having vanished from every number she'd been given without explanation. She was, in the most literal sense, alone. She forced herself to breathe. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Her hands stopped shaking, just slightly, just enough to unlock her apartment door and slip inside, locking it behind her, sliding the chain across, with fingers that still trembled at the edges. She didn't turn on the lights. She'd learned that habit too. Somewhere in the last 2 years, the instinct that darkness made you a harder target for anyone watching from outside, though she had no real way of knowing if anyone was watching at all. She crossed to the window instead, peering down through the gap in her curtains at the street below, and that was when she saw it. The black sedan, idling, headlights off, parked at an angle that gave a clear view of her building's entrance. It might have been nothing. A driver waiting for a fare. A neighbor's late-arriving guest. Seoul was full of black sedans parked at odd hours for 1,000 mundane reasons. But Tina had survived this long by never assuming the mundane explanation when her instincts screamed otherwise. And right now, every cell in her body was screaming. She sat down on the edge of her narrow bed, phone still in hand, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, allowed herself to fully consider the possibility that 2 years of careful, quiet survival might be about to come apart in a single night, undone not by the people who'd been hunting her, but by a stranger's cruelty, and a phone camera in a restaurant she'd thought, foolishly, was the one safe place she had left. She didn't know yet that 2 floors above that very restaurant, a man with far more power than Hana Kim could ever dream of, had already begun pulling threads that would lead, inevitably, to her door. She didn't know that the comment burning a hole in her notifications had also reached a private security monitoring system, one of dozens Kang Do-yoon's organization quietly maintained across platforms specifically to flag suspicious activity tied to anything connected to his properties, his staff, his restaurants. She didn't know that within the hour, Suho would burst back into Do-yoon's private booth, tablet in hand, face uncharacteristically pale, with words that would change the entire trajectory of the night. "Boss," he would say, "you need to see this. Right now. It's about the waitress, and it is so much worse than I thought. But that part of the story, besties, is coming up next. And trust me, once you see what Suho found, you're going to understand exactly why Kang Do-yoon stood up from that booth for the first time in years." Agag Suho didn't knock. He shoved the private booth door open hard enough that it bounced against the wall. Tablet clutched to his chest like it might bite him if he loosened his grip. And for the first time in longer than Do-yun could remember, his face had lost every trace of its usual easy humor. "Boss," Suho said, breathless, "you need to see this. Right now, it's about the waitress, and it is so much worse than I thought." Do-yun set down the report he'd been reading and turned fully toward him. The stillness in his posture, the kind that made grown men in boardrooms reconsider their next sentence. "Show me." Suho slid the tablet across the table, his hand not quite steady. "I dug into that relocation network the way you asked. Quiet channels, contacts who owe me favors. The usual. Took some calling in old debts, but I found a name. Sparrow Network. Heard of it? Vaguely. Underground witness relocation, mostly West African and Southeast Asian corridors. Funded by donors who'd rather not be publicly associated with it. Why? Because that tattoo on her wrist. The little bird. It's not decoration. It's their mark. They ink every protected asset they relocate. Something small enough to hide easily, but distinct enough that anyone in their network, or anyone hunting their network, recognizes it instantly. Suho tapped the screen, pulling up a grainy photo. An old intelligence bulletin from a private security firm Do-yun occasionally traded information with. That's the exact symbol. Wings spread, mid-flight. Same wrist placement. This isn't a coincidence, boss. She's not just hiding from an abusive ex or a bad family situation. She's a protected witness in something big enough that an entire underground network thought she needed permanent relocation. Moonlight, Do-yun's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Protected from whom? Working on that part. But here's where it gets worse. Suho swiped to another screen, a live feed from one of the monitoring systems his team maintained, scanning for keywords and patterns across social platforms connected to anything tied to their properties. That viral video, the comment section blew up after it crossed 200,000 views about 40 minutes ago. Most of it's the usual internet noise, but buried in there, one comment, no profile picture, account created today, posted directly under a screenshot someone took that clearly shows her wrist. He turned the tablet so Do-yun could read it himself. "We found you." The silence in the booth stretched long enough that the ambient hum of the restaurant below seemed to grow louder by comparison. 2 years of hiding, Do-yun said slowly. Undone by a rich girl's tantrum and a phone camera. Pretty much. Yeah. And boss, whoever sent that comment, they're not internet trolls. The account pinged from an IP address that bounced through 3 relay servers before landing somewhere in Lagos. That's not random cruelty. That's professional reconnaissance. Somebody official enough, or dangerous enough, to need that level of cover just to leave a comment. Do-yun stood up. It was not a dramatic gesture. No flourish, no announcement. But Suho had worked for this man long enough to know that when Kang Do-yun stood, decisions had already been made several steps ahead of whatever conversation was currently happening. Where does she live? Already pulled it from her HR file. 15 minutes from here. Give or take traffic. Get the car. Boss, Suho hesitated, the way he did exactly twice a year when he genuinely thought a course correction was necessary. I want to be clear about what we're walking into here. If this woman is a protected witness in an international case, and somebody just located her tonight because of that video, then whoever's coming for her isn't coming to talk. You understand that, right? This isn't a negotiation situation. This is a removal situation, and we have zero operational reason to insert ourselves into it. She's a waitress, a good one, sure, with apparently a very interesting past, but she's not your problem. Do-yun was already pulling on his coat. She works in my restaurant. People work in your restaurant all the time. You don't personally drive across the city for every server who has a bad night. This isn't about a bad night. Do-yun paused at the door, looking back at his oldest friend, the only person alive who could speak to him with this much unguarded honesty and survive it unscathed. 15 years, Suho. 15 years I've watched people in this city decide other people's worth based on how loudly they can complain in public, how much money they can throw around, how many cameras they can put in front of someone else's humiliation. I watched a woman tonight get treated like she was disposable by someone who has never once in her life had to fight for anything. And then I find out she spent 2 years fighting for her life under everyone's nose while serving wine to people who will never know her name correctly. That's a very compelling speech, boss, but it didn't actually answer my question. It's my restaurant, Do-yoon said simply, and she's my responsibility. That's the answer. Get the car. Suho sighed, the particular sigh of a man who had stopped fighting battles he knew he'd already lost about 30 seconds ago, and pulled out his phone to make the call. For the record, I'm putting in writing that I expressed professional concern about this decision. Noted. Also for the record, this is exactly the kind of thing that turns into a wedding within 6 months. I've seen this pattern before. You get protective, then you get curious, then you get, Suho, getting the car. Right now. Going. Across the city, Tina had not moved from the edge of her bed in nearly 20 minutes. The black sedan still idling outside, her phone still clutched in her trembling hands, the message still glowing on the screen like a wound that refused to close. We found you. She had run through every option twice already, the way her mind had trained itself to do whenever the ground felt like it might disappear beneath her. Call the police and risk explaining a fabricated identity, a fraudulent visa sponsorship, a story that would unravel faster than it could protect her. Call Ngozi and risk dragging the one person who actually cared about her into danger she had no right to share. Run now, tonight, with nothing but what fit in a single bag, and start the entire exhausting cycle of disappearing all over again. Somewhere new, somewhere she'd have to learn the streets and the language and the rhythm of survival from scratch. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she nearly dropped it, her heart slamming against her ribs before she registered the name on the screen. Ngozi. She answered with a voice she fought hard to keep level. Hey, okay. Before you say anything, I need you to know I am extremely calm right now, Ngozi said, in the exact tone of someone who was not calm at all. But your face just appeared on my For You page for the 4th time tonight, and I need you to tell me you're okay. Because the comment section under this thing is unhinged. People are saying all kinds of wild stuff. And there's this one comment that's just sitting there being incredibly creepy, and I don't like it. I saw it, Tina said quietly. You saw the "we found you" one? Okay. See, that's the one that's freaking me out. Tina, who found you? What does that even mean? Is this about like an ex? Do you have a scary ex I don't know about? Because I will fight him. I want you to know that. I have very little to lose. Tina closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the cold wall of her apartment, feeling, for one brief, terrifying second, the overwhelming temptation to simply tell her the entire truth. 2 years of carrying it alone, suddenly feeling unbearably heavy. It's complicated, she said instead. The same answer she'd been giving for 2 years, the answer that had kept Ngozi at arm's length from the danger that surrounded her, without ever fully closing the door on their friendship. Tina. Ngozi's voice softened, dropping the dramatic edge entirely. I'm not stupid. I've known you 2 years. I know you don't talk about your family much. I know you flinch every time someone asks where exactly in Nigeria you're from, like the question itself is dangerous. I know you have, like, 3 exits memorized in every building we've ever been in together. I've never pushed, because I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. But if something's actually wrong right now, tonight, you need to tell me. Please. Outside, through the gap in her curtains, Tina watched the black sedan's headlights suddenly flick on, illuminating the wet street in 2 long beams of white light. The car began rolling forward. Ngozi, Tina said, her voice suddenly sharp with a fear she could no longer fully hide. I need you to listen to me very carefully. If anything happens to me tonight, anything at all, I need you to... The sedan pulled up directly outside her building and stopped. A car door opened. Tina, what's happening? You're scaring me. Footsteps on wet pavement. Slow, deliberate. The kind that belonged to someone who had no reason to rush because they were certain of exactly where they were going. Tina's hand hovered over the latch on her door, her mind racing through the geography of her tiny apartment, the fire escape outside her bathroom window that she'd checked exactly once when she moved in, and never used since, the kitchen knife block on her counter that suddenly felt less like a cooking tool and more like the only weapon she had. The footsteps stopped outside her door. A knock. 3 measured taps. Unhurried, almost polite. "Tina Johnson," a man's voice said from the other side, calm and accented faintly with something she couldn't immediately place. Not Korean, not quite Nigerian either, the careful, neutral tone of someone trained to sound unthreatening, regardless of intent. "I just want to talk, that's all." She said nothing, backing away from the door, her phone still pressed to her ear. Ngozi's voice now a frantic, distant murmur she could no longer fully process. "You don't have to open the door," the voice continued, patient, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I understand you're frightened. I would be too, in your position. But I think you already know why I'm here, and I think you know it would be easier for both of us if we simply talked." Tina's back hit the kitchen counter. Her fingers found the knife block by instinct, sliding the largest blade free, with a soft scrape of metal she prayed he hadn't heard. "Tell whoever sent you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "that I never had the documents. I never made copies. I never gave anything to anyone. Whatever you think I have, I don't have it. I just want to be left alone." A pause from the other side of the door, long enough that hope flickered, briefly, dangerously, in her chest. "That's a very specific thing to say," the voice replied, "for someone who claims to have nothing worth finding." The door handle began to turn. It was locked. The chain still latched, but the sound of it, the small, mechanical click of someone testing whether she'd left herself any safety at all, sent a wave of pure animal terror through her body that made the knife in her hand feel suddenly, uselessly small. And then, just as the handle stopped turning, just as the man on the other side seemed to be deciding his next move, a second set of footsteps, faster, heavier, multiple sets, thundered up the stairwell outside. "Move away from the door," a new voice barked, sharp and authoritative, accented in fluent Korean this time, the kind of command that expected to be obeyed instantly, and usually was. Now. There was a scuffle outside, the unmistakable sounds of bodies colliding, a grunt of pain, something heavy slamming against the hallway wall, hard enough that Tina felt the vibration through her own door. She pressed herself flat against the kitchen counter, the knife trembling in her grip, Ngozi's voice still screaming her name through the phone she'd somehow forgotten she was holding. Then, silence, followed by a single, polite knock. "Miss Johnson." The new voice again, calmer now, though still carrying that same undertone of absolute authority. "My name is Kang Do-yun. I own the restaurant where you work. The man who was just at your door will no longer be bothering you tonight, or any night after this. I would like a few minutes of your time, if you're willing, to explain why I'm here and what I think is happening to you. You're under no obligation to open this door, but I think it would be in both our interests if you did." Tina stood frozen, knife still in hand, heart hammering so loudly she could feel it in her throat, trying desperately to reconcile the chaos of the last 10 minutes with the bizarre, surreal calm of the man's voice, now waiting patiently on the other side of her door. "How do I know you're not lying?" she finally managed, her voice cracking slightly despite every effort to keep it level. "How do I know this isn't exactly what someone would say to get me to open the door?" A pause. Then, "You don't. Not with certainty. I understand that. But I'd point out that if I wanted to harm you, Miss Johnson, I would not have just had my men remove someone who came here specifically to do that, and I would not currently be standing in your hallway, alone and unarmed, explaining myself through a locked door, instead of simply forcing my way in. I am asking for your trust. I am aware I have not earned it yet." Through the phone, Ngozi's voice finally broke through the haze. "Tina, what is happening? Who is talking? Are you safe?" "I'll call you back," Tina whispered, and ended the call before Ngozi could protest. Her eyes fixed on the locked door, her entire body caught in the impossible space between terror and the strange, undeniable pull of a voice that, despite everything, sounded exactly like someone telling the truth. She set the knife down on the counter. Not far, within reach, but down. Slowly, carefully, she crossed the small room and undid the chain. Kang Do-yun stood in her doorway, his coat still damp from the rain outside, his expression unreadable in the dim hallway light. and behind him, slumped against the far wall, hands zip-tied, a man Tina had never seen before in her life, but whose presence alone made every nightmare she'd been carrying for 2 years suddenly, terrifyingly real. "He came alone," Do-yoon said, following her gaze. "Which tells me whoever sent him underestimated how quickly we'd find him. That's the only piece of good news I have for you tonight, Miss Johnson. The rest of what I need to tell you is going to be considerably harder to hear." Tina stared at him, at the calm, controlled stranger who had apparently just saved her life, at the unconscious man tied up in her hallway, at the absolute wreckage of everything she had spent 2 years carefully building, and felt the last of her composure finally, completely give way. "Who are you?" she whispered, "and what do you actually want from me?" "The truth," Do-yoon said quietly, "and the chance to help you, if you'll let me. But first, I think you should sit down. Because what I'm about to tell you about that mark on your wrist, and about exactly how many people already know you're in this city, is going to change everything you thought you understood about how much time you actually have left." Svag, Tina, didn't sit. Not at first. She stood in the middle of her own small apartment, arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring at the man who had just saved her life, as though sitting down might mean accepting that any of this was real. "Start talking," she said. "All of it. I want to know everything you know, right now." Do-yoon studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, the kind of nod that suggested he respected the demand more than he would ever say out loud. "The mark on your wrist. You know what it means. Sparrow Network. Protection mark." Her voice was flat, controlled, though her hands had begun to shake again. "I was told it would only mean something to people who already knew to look for it. It does." And someone looked. Do-yoon gestured toward the unconscious man still slumped against the hallway wall. Whoever sent that video into the world tonight had no idea what they captured on camera. But the people who employ men like him, they know exactly what that mark means. And they've apparently been waiting 2 years for the chance to find you again. "You said he came alone. How do you know that's true?" "Because professionals don't send their best resources first when they're not certain of a target's exact location. They send a scout, someone disposable enough to lose if things go wrong, reliable enough to confirm a sighting if things go right." Do-yoon's voice remained level, almost clinical, but something in his eyes carried a weight that suggested he understood, intimately, exactly how these calculations worked, because he'd made similar ones himself, more times than he probably wanted to admit. "Which means the people who sent him are still in Lagos, or wherever they're operating from, waiting for confirmation before they commit more resources. We have a window. It will not stay open long." "We," Tina repeated. "There is no we. I don't know you. I don't know why you're here, why you have men capable of doing whatever that was in my hallway, why a restaurant owner suddenly has the resources of an intelligence operation. Fair questions." Do-yoon's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Almost. The honest answer is that the restaurant business is not the only business I'm in. Most of what I actually do, I'd prefer didn't end up in conversation, for both our sakes. But I can tell you this. I have resources that the official channels you're afraid to trust simply don't have. Speed, discretion, and people loyal enough that information doesn't leak the way it does in government systems. So you're telling me you're some kind of criminal?" "I'm telling you I'm someone who can help you survive the next 72 hours, Do-yoon said, "which, right now, matters considerably more than whatever label you'd like to attach to me." Tina finally sat, lowering herself slowly onto the edge of her bed, the adrenaline finally beginning to drain from her body and leave behind the bone-deep exhaustion of 2 years of fear catching up all at once. "Why would you do this?" she said quietly. "I'm a waitress. You don't know me. You watched me get humiliated tonight, and instead of doing nothing, like everyone else in that restaurant, you're here, in my apartment, with men who tie up assassins like it's Tuesday. Why?" Do-yoon was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting briefly toward the window, toward the city lights beyond it, and when he answered, his voice had lost some of its careful control, just slightly, just enough to be noticeable. "Because I watched you kneel on that floor tonight, soaked in wine, humiliated in front of 40 strangers and a dozen cameras," he said. And in the middle of that, you still noticed someone else's shoes were about to get ruined, and you quietly fixed it, without anyone asking you to, without anyone even noticing, except me. I've spent 15 years building an organization on the principle that real strength isn't loud. It's controlled. It's the ability to keep your head when everything around you is falling apart. I have met very few people in my entire life who carry that the way you do tonight, under that much pressure, with that much at stake. I'm not interested in watching someone like that get erased by men who think a tattoo and a viral video are enough to justify it. Tina studied his face for a long moment, searching for the lie she'd trained herself to expect from everyone. The angle, the price tag attached to every offer of help she'd ever received since this nightmare began 2 years ago. She didn't find it. Or if it was there, it was buried deeper than she had the energy left to dig for that night. "What happens now?" she finally asked. "Now you pack what you need. Not everything, just what matters. You're not staying here tonight, and you're probably not staying in this apartment again at all." Do-yun stood, moving toward the door with the same controlled efficiency he seemed to bring to everything. "I have a property outside the city. Secure, private. You'll be safe there while my people figure out exactly who sent that man, and how close they are to sending more. And then what? I just live in hiding forever. Again, except this time it's your hiding instead of the networks?" "No." Do-yun's voice was firm. "Then we figure out how to end this properly. Permanently. Whatever happened 2 years ago that made you valuable enough to chase across continents, that case is still open. You said so yourself, which means there's still a path to justice, if you're willing to walk it. And this time, you won't be walking it alone." It would take 3 more days before Tina fully understood exactly what that promise meant. 3 days hidden away in a quiet house outside Seoul that belonged, on paper, to a holding company so deeply buried in legal paperwork that even forensic accountants would have struggled to trace it back to Kang Do-yun. 3 days of careful, methodical work by Suho and a small team of people whose actual job titles Tina never learned, piecing together exactly how deep the Lagos operations reach extended, exactly who had sent the man now sitting in a very uncomfortable, very secure room somewhere Tina didn't ask about. What they found was worse than she'd feared, and somehow, also, the key to finally ending it. The man captured outside her apartment, once properly motivated to talk, which Tina chose not to ask too many specifics about, confirmed exactly what Suho had suspected. He worked for a security contractor frequently retained by the chief's logistics conglomerate, the same company Tina had worked compliance for nearly 3 years earlier, the same company whose falsified shipping manifests she had nearly exposed before her entire life had been dismantled to silence her. But here was the part that changed everything. The man also confirmed, under the kind of careful, patient pressure Do-yun's organization specialized in applying, that the chief had never stopped operating the same fraudulent shipping scheme Tina had originally discovered. If anything, it had grown larger, more brazen, protected by 2 years of unchallenged silence after the only witness who'd nearly exposed it had been forced to disappear. "He's still doing it," Tina said, staring at the documents Suho had managed to recover through channels she didn't fully understand and didn't particularly want explained. "All this time, I disappeared to survive, and he just kept going. Which is exactly why he's vulnerable now in a way he wasn't 2 years ago," Do-yun said, sitting across from her at the long wooden table in the safe house's kitchen, the same controlled calm in his voice that she'd come to find, against every instinct of caution she had left, oddly steadying. 2 years ago, you were a junior compliance officer, with suspicions and no proof, no protection, no leverage. Now you have testimony, a documented attempt on your life on foreign soil, and an organization with resources he's never had to account for standing behind you. You're saying I should go public. I'm saying you finally have a real chance to make sure what happened to you means something, instead of just being something that happened to you." Do-yun's eyes held hers steadily. "But that has to be your decision, Tina, not mine. I won't pretend the risk disappears just because I'm involved. It changes shape, that's all." Tina was quiet for a long moment, turning the weight of 2 years over in her mind, the fear that had governed every decision, every flinch, every carefully chosen word, since she'd fled Lagos, with nothing but a fabricated identity and a tattoo she hadn't asked for, but had come to think of as proof that somewhere, someone, had believed her worth protecting. "I'm tired of disappearing," she said finally. "I want him to answer for what he did. Not just to me, to everyone he's been doing this to for years, while I hid because I was too scared to fight." Do-yoon nodded once, the smallest hint of something that might have been pride flickering across his expression. "Then we fight." What followed over the next 2 weeks was, by Suho's own dramatic accounting, the most paperwork-intensive operation Do-yoon's organization had ever undertaken that didn't involve actual shipping containers. International contacts were quietly activated, the kind of careful diplomatic and legal pressure that an organization with Do-yoon's reach could apply without ever appearing to apply it directly. Evidence routed through proper channels, disguised as anonymous tips. Tina's testimony finally delivered, not to a corrupt local system that had already failed her once, but to an international anti-trafficking task force, with jurisdiction broad enough that even the chief's considerable resources couldn't bury it. It took 6 weeks total before the news broke. A major logistics conglomerate in Lagos under federal investigation for trafficking, fraud, and witness intimidation spanning multiple countries. The kind of headline that made international news cycles for exactly as long as these things ever did, before the world's attention moved on to the next crisis. But for Tina, watching the news alert appear on her phone from the relative safety of Do-yoon's protection, it meant something the rest of the world would never fully understand. It meant 2 years of running had finally been worth something. It also meant, 3 weeks later, sitting in a quiet courtroom annex via secure video testimony, watching the chief's composed, expensive lawyer fail spectacularly to discredit evidence that Do-yoon's people had spent weeks meticulously, legally building, that she would never have to disappear again. Hana Kim's story ended considerably less triumphantly. The video that had humiliated Tina, the one that had set off the entire chain of events, had also, in the strange and unpredictable way the internet works, eventually found its way to a different kind of attention entirely. Once journalists covering the international trafficking investigation began connecting the dots. Once it became public knowledge that the viral humiliation video had inadvertently exposed a protected witness's location and very nearly gotten her killed, the public's appetite for entertainment had curdled rapidly into outrage. Hana Kim's father, who had spent decades carefully cultivating his department store empire's public image, did not appreciate his daughter's name suddenly appearing in international headlines alongside the words, "nearly got someone killed for entertainment." Within days, Hana found herself uninvited from the social circles that had once orbited her so reliably, her father's company quietly distancing itself from her public behavior in carefully worded statements. The friends who had laughed along with her cruelty suddenly nowhere to be found, the way fair-weather friends always disappear the moment the weather actually turns. She showed up at Cheongdam Noir exactly once after that, weeks later, hovering uncertainly near the entrance until Mr. O, who had clearly learned at least one lesson from the entire ordeal, informed her with surprising firmness that her reservation had been cancelled and would not be rebooked. "On whose authority?" Hana demanded, her old confidence flickering weakly like a candle running out of wax. "Mine," said a voice from behind her, and she turned to find Tina standing there, in a uniform that no longer fit quite the same way it used to. Not because anything had physically changed, but because the woman wearing it carried herself entirely differently now. Hana's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, searching for the cruelty that had always come so easily before, and finding, apparently, that it had nowhere left to land. "I didn't know," Hana finally said, the closest thing to an apology Tina suspected she had ever attempted in her entire life. "About all of it. The case, the danger. I didn't know." "I know you didn't know," Tina said, and her voice carried no triumph in it, no satisfaction, just a tired, hard-won clarity. "That's actually the whole problem, isn't it? You didn't think you needed to know. You just decided someone like me didn't matter enough to wonder about." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back into the restaurant, and Hana Kim stood alone on the sidewalk outside Cheongdam Noir. the cold Seoul evening settling around her. Finally, for perhaps the first time in her entire pampered life, completely without an audience. As for Kang Do-yoon, the public face of Chairman K never changed. The careful anonymity he'd built over 15 years remaining intact. His organization's quiet involvement in dismantling an international trafficking operation buried so deeply beneath layers of legal misdirection that no journalist ever connected the dots back to a restaurant owner in Gangnam. But behind closed doors, something had shifted permanently. Tina stayed at Cheongdam Noir, though her role there changed considerably over the following months. Do-yoon, with the kind of methodical patience he applied to everything, had offered her a position within one of his legitimate logistics consulting firms, work that used the exact compliance expertise that had nearly gotten her killed in the first place, now properly protected, properly valued. "I'm not taking this job because you saved my life," she told him plainly, the first week she sat across from him at his actual office, reviewing the offer with the same careful skepticism she applied to everything. "I'm taking it because I'm genuinely good at it, and you genuinely need someone who is." "I'm aware," Do-yoon said, with something that might almost have been amusement. "I wouldn't have offered it otherwise. I don't hire people out of guilt, Miss Johnson. I hire them because they're useful, and you happen to be considerably more useful than most people I've met in 15 years of running this business. That might be the strangest compliment anyone's ever given me. I'm told I have a gift for that." Ngozi, predictably, had opinions about all of it. Opinions she shared loudly and often, usually over instant noodles in Tina's new, considerably safer apartment. An apartment with proper security. An apartment Tina no longer had to memorize escape routes from out of pure necessity. "So let me get this straight," Ngozi said one evening, slurping noodles with theatrical exaggeration. "You got humiliated by a rich brat. It turned out you're secretly a witness in an international trafficking case, a literal mafia boss saved your life and then gave you a job, and now you two have, what, weekly business meetings that somehow always run 2 hours longer than necessary? They're not weekly. They're weekly, Tina. It's a complicated business relationship." "Uh-huh." Ngozi raised an eyebrow with the precision of someone who had been waiting months for this exact conversation. "And does this complicated business relationship involve him personally walking you to your car every single time, or is that just standard mafia boss customer service?" Tina didn't answer, which, Ngozi noted with enormous satisfaction, was answer enough. The truth, the part Tina wasn't quite ready to say out loud even to herself, was that something had indeed shifted between them over those months. Something built not on the dramatic rescue or the danger they'd survived together, but on the quieter, steadier accumulation of small moments. The way he listened when she explained shipping discrepancies with the same intense focus he brought to multi-million-dollar negotiations. The way he'd shown up, unannounced but never unwelcome, at the small commemorative dinner she'd organized with Ngozi and Mr. O, who had quietly resigned his management position out of guilt and taken a much smaller, much kinder role at a different restaurant entirely. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was, fittingly, exactly the kind of thing that grew in silence, in patience, the same quality that had drawn his attention to her in the first place on a night that had started as the worst humiliation of her life and ended, somehow, as the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for. Power does not always shout, Tina had thought once, watching him across a quiet room. The same line he'd told her himself during those first terrifying days in the safe house, when she'd asked why he hadn't simply marched downstairs and put a stop to Hana's cruelty the moment it started. Sometimes it waits, quietly, patiently, until the exact right moment to move. And sometimes, the people who survive the longest, the people who change the most, are the ones who understood that all along, even when no one else was watching. And really, besties, isn't that the lesson worth sitting with long after this video ends? That the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful one. That the people who stay calm under pressure, who carry themselves with quiet discipline, even when the whole world is watching them kneel, are usually the ones who end up standing tallest in the end. So tell me, what do you think really saved Tina that night? Was it pure luck that Chairman K happened to be watching? Or do you think some things in this world have a way of finding exactly the people who need them, exactly when they need them most. Drop your honest thoughts in the comments, because we read every single one, and we genuinely want to know what part of this story stuck with you the most. If you enjoyed this story, imagine having 20 more unforgettable mafia boss romances ready to read or listen to whenever you want. That's exactly why I created the Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. Inside, you'll find 15 complete stories, 20 audiobook versions, and 5 exclusive bonus stories that aren't available on YouTube. You can get instant access through the link in the description. Hit that subscribe button, smash that like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Because this channel is built entirely on stories like this one. Stories that remind us that dignity isn't something other people get to take from you, no matter how loud they shout or how many cameras they hold up while they try. And if you want to know what happens when the chief, sitting in a Lagos courtroom facing charges he never thought would catch up to him, finally learns exactly whose restaurant his men walked into that night, and exactly who has been quietly building the case against him from behind a wall of glass that looks like a mirror, stay close, because that part of the story is coming, and trust me, it is far from over. Thank you for staying with us through this one, besties. Until next time, remember, the quiet ones are usually the ones to watch. See you in the next story.